Kawalik, I'm Frank Blanquette. Welcome to FNX Now. This episode produced in partnership with Ethnic Media Services as part of their briefings tracking COVID-19 and its effect on ethnic minorities. Today's topic is climate change and the pandemic, their effects on minority groups, including Native American and indigenous communities in the US and abroad. Let's welcome our moderator, Sunita Sarabji. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Sunita.
As am I. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us once again. So Dr. Westerling of UC Merced will be discussing California's wildfires. Some of us have faced our own evacuation warnings and orders, even as we're on these briefings. So this is an increasingly important issue for our readers and reporters. Dr. Westerling, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, thank you. These fires are exceptional. This is the largest fire season in California record and the largest, most severe fire season that we know of, even before documentary records, in the sense that in the past, there were years with frequent burning done by the indigenous peoples to manage the landscape, but they were not high severity fires like this that are having huge impact on ecosystems as well as on the communities that they threaten. And not just directly affecting people who live in and around the fires themselves, but millions more who are impacted by air pollution that they cause. On the other hand, they're not unanticipated. So for the last 12 to 15 years, I have led the climate assessment activities for the state of California, specifically for wildfire. There have been 4 impact assessments conducted for the state, and we're currently in the early stages of the 5th assessment now. And part of what we do for these assessments is we simulate fires in the state on a grid over the whole state, month by month, for 150 years for a wide range of climate scenarios, but also scenarios around, say, population growth, development footprint, fuels management, and a variety of other topics. So, for example, the 4th climate assessment was published in 2018. We actually simulated fires, 100 million maps of fires around the state, statewide, as part of that. So looking at individual extreme events and seasons. And we projected that this kind of thing would be happening with increasing frequency. By mid-century, the climate conditions are such that 30 years from now, this would be potentially a very common event. So this is something that is deeply concerning when you look at the impacts economically, but also psychologically and in public health. Climate change is definitely the primary driver here. It's true that there were many decades of fire suppression and land management that contributed to increased fuel loads, particularly on federal lands in our national forests. And that legacy of past management has resulted in a fuel situation there that is amplifying the effects of climate change. So it's the interaction between these other things we've done in the past and climate change that's contributing to some of the fire severity and frequency and size. But there are fires burning in the state and a lot of other ecosystems that are not as directly affected by past management in ways that would make them burn more severely today than they would have, 100 or 500 years ago. And yet they are burning more also. And this is true around the Western United States. So climate change is not a one-off thing that happens and then you're done and now you have a new normal. There will be no new normal. So the changes that are in our climate system that are driving our experience like we're having this year in our very active fire season are something that are going to continue to change at an increasing pace for the rest of the lifespan of everyone alive today in the state and around the planet. What we can do is take a two-pronged approach, multi-pronged approach. On the one hand, we need to do everything we can to slow down the pace of climate change by getting our emissions to zero and then actually getting to negative emissions. We have to start taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But then we also need to start managing our landscape in ways, more intensively in ways that will reduce our vulnerability and reduce the impact of the fires that we do have. And similarly, we need to start thinking more carefully about our communities, their spatial footprint, how we develop in the future, where we put new housing. We have a severe housing crisis in the state already. If we use it as an opportunity to infill in existing communities where we can create more housing options that are safer and don't increase the risk and the difficulty of managing these fires in the wildland-urban interface, we'd be much better off than if we allow more sprawling development that puts more and more people at risk and makes it more and more difficult to manage these fire seasons going into the future. And I'll stop here and entertain questions.
Dr. Westerling, the president said that this was poor management of, as you said, our vegetation. Could you comment on the president's remarks?
I don't know of any forest types or any vegetation types that co-evolved with rakes, but we did have ecosystems that co-evolved with fire. And we have, through suppression, but also land use changes that fragment the landscape or grazing and things like that, allowed for changes in the fuels in those, because we had fewer fires for a while. Now we're getting more fires, but in an unnatural situation for the fuels. It's ironic that that message is coming from the president because he oversees the federal government, and the federal government owns most of the forest land in the western United States, and especially in California, and that's the primary location where this story has played out, is in federal forests, particularly in California and the Southwest. And so it's really his responsibility as president to be making sure that those lands are managed appropriately by federal agencies. When you look at the state, California has actually been taking money from the carbon auctions. So we have the cap and trade auction revenue, and some of that money is being put by the state into fuels management. And they've had a hard time getting the federal government to step up and contribute its share to expand the areas that are treated every year. And so the state is basically offering to take, a 50-50 split of responsibility, even though the lands are federal lands and should be primarily the responsibility of the federal government and not the state government. Beyond that, you don't do fuels management in chaparral or wet forests that don't burn more than once a century, grasslands. What you do is you create buffers around communities, and most of our fuels work has been going to that already. What we need to emphasize always is it doesn't matter how much fuel is there, if it's not dry enough to burn, you're not going to have a fire, right? So it's the interaction of the fuels and what we've done to them over time in some locations, but not everywhere, with climate change that's really driving this. So,
Sunita, two questions from my end, Dr. Westerling. Where the focus is on wildfires, but it seems to me the longer term challenge is also water, the absence of water and drought. Could you tell us what we're looking at in terms of water issues and drought?
This is a pretty arid climate, a Mediterranean climate. We have a long summer, dry season, and the peak of our fire season, it usually occurs in the fall, when the dry conditions extend into the part of the year where the winds start to pick up as the season changes. And then typically we have a rainstorm that will put out fires and raise the relative humidity, wet the fuels, and basically bring an end to the season, the fire season. You might still get some small fires, but you wouldn't get a really big conflagration. And you guys may have noticed that has been failing occasionally in recent years. So we had the Thomas fire a few years ago in Ventura. That was the first mega fire in December in the state history. And we didn't have enough precipitation all the way into the middle of December to prevent an event like that. And it was at the time the largest fire in state history. So that is part of the story here for people really to focus on, is that the same things that are driving our increased fire severity and size and frequency in the state are also the things that are affecting our water supply. So most of the rainfall in California comes in the mid-fall to, say, the end of May. And it's concentrated in a relatively small number of storms. And it doesn't take a big difference. You know, if you lose 2 storms, that's a dry year. If you get 2 extra ones, that's a really wet year. And so that's part of the dynamic behind the high variability we already have. And climate change is increasing that variability. So we're more likely to lose storms in our shoulder seasons, so the fall or the spring, than we are in the middle of the winter. And that means we get less precipitation overall, and it's concentrated over a shorter period of time in the year. And that really extends the fire season as well as impacting our water supplies. Another way that climate change is impacting fire and our water supply is just increased temperatures means more evaporation. And that means that for decades now, year in and year out, in wet years and dry years, we've been evaporating more moisture. The cumulative effect is to dry out the landscape. It's also to reduce the amount of water that comes into our reservoirs as runoff. Right? So it's the same effects on our wildfire season are also manifesting themselves in our water supply. And finally, there's a third effect, which is really that warmer temperatures mean that a greater proportion of the precipitation we do get comes as rain and less as snow. And the snow is what carries over some of the winter precipitation into the late spring and early summer. We don't have, you know, if you go onto the Colorado River, they have some really huge dams, and those dams can hold back collectively, you know, the 2 biggest dams, 2 years of the flow of the river, and all of them together about 4 years of the average flow of the river. In California, it's a different situation. We have a bunch of smaller dams on smaller rivers and tributaries, and a lot of our storage is really in the snow. So we manage those dams in California for flood control earlier in the season, and then as we get later into the spring, we manage them for water supply. And because we're getting more rain and less snow, and then warmer temperatures in the spring mean that the snow we do have melts out sooner, we're getting that snow melt runoff pulse earlier and earlier in the year. And now we have a conflict between how we want to manage those dams. We want to manage them for flood control at the same time that we're also trying to manage them for water supply. So we don't have the redundancy in storage in California that allows us to make up for this shift in the timing of the spring snowmelt. And we're losing that sort of natural storage of the snowpack in the mountains. And that is also extending our fire season, because now our mountain forests will dry out sooner in the year. And that can move the fire season back much earlier at those elevations. And we have a water storage problem as well. So all of this goes together. If you look at that really extreme drought we had in the previous decade, that was the strongest, most intense drought in California in at least 1,200 years. And it was greatly exacerbated by climate change, both through its effects on temperature and on the amount of snow and timing of snow melt, and then the variability of precipitation. All those things were basically enhanced impacts on this drought because of climate change. And that just underscores the insecurity of our water supply going forward, but it also has had a tremendous impact on the wildfires that we've been experiencing in the state since that time, because a lot of vegetation was killed. And so we have this standing dead vegetation, as well as the new stuff that's growing up and drying out in our dry season. And so some of the fires that we're experiencing this year, for example, are greatly enhanced. So they're much more severe because of these accumulated dead fuels from the drought and the related beetle infestations that occurred in our forests.
Dr. Westerling, can you stay on for one more question?
Yes.
Okay, Frank, could you please ask your question?
Thank you, Sunita. Dr. Westerling, can you comment on the traditional fire burning practiced by California and other tribes across the Western states? These cultural burns aim to clean up the overgrown brush that would otherwise be fuel for these huge fires, and traditionally hundreds of thousands of acres were burned. Might this be something that is thought about to help combat fires in the future?
So, yes, it was a primary way that the indigenous peoples in California managed the landscape for increased productivity and reducing fire risk. And it's not something that just doesn't happen today. There are a whole cadre of, especially federal land managers, that employ very aggressive fuels management practices that are basically modeled after this, but informed by science about current conditions as well. And they include quite a few personnel from the tribes in California working through the Bureau of Indian Affairs fire apparatus. The difficulty going forward is that it's the same difficulty we have when we're modeling fire and what can happen under climate change is we're moving into climate states, so climatic conditions that are outside the range, not just of recent historical experience, but outside the range of the Holocene since the last ice age. And so whether it's traditional practices of the communities that, you know, evolved their land management practices in response to the environment that they found themselves in, or the management policies of federal and state agencies, you know, over a much briefer period today. In either case, they cannot no longer just be looking at the past experience that informed how they do things today. They have to be projecting into a very complex and different future. And trying to adapt the lessons of the past in a way that they're still applicable to dealing with the risks that are changing as we move into the future.
Dr. Westerling, thank you so much. We really appreciate your comments. We move on to Dr. Robert Bullard, the author of 18 books regarding climate justice. And most significantly, Dr. Bullard, your book on Hurricane Katrina and how communities responded in the wake of that. So welcome, Dr. Bullard.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And I am an environmentalist. I've been working on the intersection of environment and race and place for 4 decades. And if we look at environmental justice in the era of climate change and COVID, we can see that, first of all, communities of color are disproportionately, in the US, are disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution. And if you look at that connection between pollution and COVID, a recent Harvard study showed that high levels of pollution, particularly particulate matter, will increase the likelihood of dying by 15% if you're in those high polluted areas. There's also a racial footprint when it comes to climate and COVID, when we talk about racial redlining, that is discrimination in the location of people being able to buy houses or not. Racial redlining practice against people of color a century ago in the 20s and 30s is showing up in terms of urban heat islands, redline neighborhoods, or neighborhoods that were discriminated against are 5 to 13 degrees hotter. Redlining is also showing up in terms of Covid-19 dangers and segregated neighborhoods of color. Long before Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, people of color knew and learned the hard way that waiting for the government can be hazardous to your health. The government has always been slow to respond to disasters when it involves poor people, working class people, and people of color. Climate change will exacerbate these inequalities and vulnerabilities of already marginalized populations. This is true in terms of, as I said before, in terms of heat stress and heat stress and urban heat islands. It's greatest in neighborhoods that were segregated, that are hyper segregated. If we look at the impact of climate change, we'll have more bad air days. And the fact that more bad air days means more unhealthy people and death. And if you look at in the US, people of color and poor people are more likely to live in cities and metropolitan areas that are in violation of the Clean Air Act. And if you look at this whole notion of health equity and racial justice, an EPA study, 2018 EPA study showed that in 46 states, people of color live with more air pollution than whites. America is segregated along racial lines, even in 2020, and so is pollution. People of color breathe 38% more polluted air than whites. And if we talk about this whole question of breathe at your own risk, we're saying that, for example, air pollution causes over 200,000 early deaths each year, and a disproportionate share of those premature deaths are poor people and people of color. African Americans are almost 3 times more likely than whites to die from asthma. And if you look at Black children, for example, Black children are 10 times more likely to die from asthma than white children. And when we talk about climate and vulnerability, who gets left behind, you know, the Hurricane Katrina was a textbook case of environmental racism and climate racism when we talk about injustice. If we talk about climate change will hit the poor and people of color in the southern United States hardest. If we do nothing in terms of climate policy in the US, the country will lose a 6% drop in its GDP. But the southern part of the US will lose a 20% drop. The South is already the poorest part of the country and the country that's least likely to move forward with progressive energy, climate, and civil rights provisions. Climate change will widen the economic gap. Disasters, resources, recovery dollars, generally the path of that it follows is money follows money, money follows power, and money follows whites. After major severe weather events that were tracked over the last couple of decades, looking at $10 billion damages, white communities, after recovery dollars were spent, on average, were $126,000 better off in wealth after the recovery dollars went in. However, communities of color, on average, lost about $29,000. Now, this is significant in that Black people and Latinos wealth is only 10% of that of white wealth. So when we talk about disaster buyouts, we talk about managed retreat, that is government buying property, houses, and buying out communities. Generally, those buyouts leave poor people behind. That is the widening gap that we're talking about. Climate action plans must address equity, racial justice, and economic justice. Addressing equity is a prerequisite for achieving climate resilience. Thank you.
Dr. Bullard, I would like to ask you first about FEMA's response in these disasters. We have seen in many cases that FEMA does not adequately respond where it's most needed. Am I right in asking that question?
You're right in asking the question, and the answer is the response, there's a disparate response depending on the populations. And again, who generally gets left behind? We did a book in 2012. Dr. Beverly Wright, who lives in New Orleans, was a Katrina survivor. Over eight decades, we looked from 1925, the Great Mississippi Flood, and brought it all the way up to 10, that's 8 decades. And we showed that government response to communities of color and poor people basically was either inadequate or no response. The title of that book is The Wrong Complexion for Protection. The essence is that right now with FEMA's COVID-19 response, new guidance saying that communities, if there's a disaster, your first line is to shelter in place, stay put. You get 6 feet, 7 feet of water, then you're going to drown if you only got one level. And so many communities right now are having to deal with COVID, sheltering in place because of disaster shelters is the last resort because of COVID. You can't shelter in place. So those communities on the front line for flooding, hurricanes, and we're dealing with communities like that right now in Lake Charles and Mossville, in Port Arthur, Texas, in Mobile right now with Sally, in Pensacola with Wedgwood. These are communities that we've worked with for the last 25, 30 years. COVID-19 has made it much more stringent, and the FEMA policies has inadvertently created additional layer of waiting to get rescued or drowning or being flooded out. Those are realities. And as I said before, all communities are not created equal, and that communities that are on the wrong side of the levee, or basically are on the low-lying areas, they are least protected by law.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you to both our panelists. Thank you to Ethnic Media Services and our moderator, Sunitha Sarabji. For FNX Now, I'm Frank Blanquette. Dios Politique. Thank you for watching.